So we're beginning chapter 4, and chapter 4 talks a little bit about language and how language influences communication. So I'd like to start off with a little study done by Cambridge University. Obviously, you folks have probably seen this. I think it was even on the back of some vitamin water bottles at one point in time, but it was all over the social media. But if you were to read this out, even though the letters are all scrambled, you can read, according to a research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and the last letter be at the right place. So you folks can make out this entire message. This is because recent research has shown that words are actual cognitive units. So even though we may have learned language phonetically, the, is, all looking at different phonemes and morphemes and how they're put together into sentence structures, when we actually look at the words themselves, they evoke certain images within our own minds. They have their own cognitive units, their own cognitive associations, and their own neural networks that are all played into each other. So today we're going to talk about those cognitive units by moving into Chapter 4. So Chapter 4 deals with the principles of verbal messages, how words actually create feelings. And most of today's lecture is going to be about how we can use language more effectively. And there is a lot of debate about what language actually evokes inside of our minds. On one side of the fence, words are just words. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But on the other hand, we do see a lot of research showing that words, in their cognitive associations, can bring a whole host of different emotional feelings about a particular message. They can be offensive, they can be violent, so there's a lot of different research that shows both of these different areas, which we'll go over today. The key thing, though, is that we need to make that distinction. The words are just definitional terms that we use to describe the universe, versus that words can evoke feelings, emotions, pathos appeals, if you will. So, first of all, we got to realize that messages are inside of the meaning inside of ourselves, right? So to discover a message's true meaning, it's necessary to look at the person as well as the words, So a lot of times, different terms and different phrases will evoke different types of emotions depending upon where your frame of reference lies. So you as an individual have a number of different bad words that will evoke different types of feelings, racist terms that you might remember from your childhood that really evoke strong emotional responses. But then again, there might be other terms that don't necessarily have that type of meaning to you, but might be offensive towards other people. The thing is also, throughout the course of your life, you change, right? So the little words that I was taunted with back in 4th grade that made me cry so bad, right, don't mean as much to me in today's day and age that they did back then. So as we change, as we get older, we change the meanings that we've created out of past messages. So what might have evoked a lot of emotion in us back when we were children doesn't necessarily evoke as much emotion with us now. So not only is language temporally spaced, but it's also individually spaced depending upon your social position. So when we think about words, obviously we can bust out a dictionary. I get the word of the day every single day so I can increase my vocabulary so I don't have to curse in front of students. But we also get different, denotations or dictionary definitions of terms inside of our everyday lives. Hopefully, by the time that you're done with college, you folks should have a veritable lexicon of different terms that you can use in different types of situations. For every word that's out there, for every word that we learn in some kind of way, we need to think about what it evokes in us emotionally, or its connotation, and then what the dictionary actually puts forward, or its denotation. So every term has two different subsets towards it. So connotation, the subjective or emotional meaning of a specific speaker's or listener's give to a particular word that's out there, whereas the denotation has to deal with the objective meaning. So the first line that we see in the dictionary, the most interpreted phrase out of the particular situation, is the objective meaning of the term, the meaning you would find in a dictionary. So to remember for the exam, because guaranteed test question about this one, dictionary is denotation, whereas connotation evokes emotional responses to a particular situation. Messages also vary in levels of abstraction. So if we think about words, there are far more abstract terms. So I can describe myself as a human, right? Or I can even describe myself as an animal at a very abstract level. However, I can describe myself as Qasim, a professor of communication here at Cypress College, which is a lot more specific or concrete. Now, in public speaking situations, when you are trying to evoke messages that are supposed to bring up imagery inside of the minds of the audience, you want to use as concrete a term as possible. You want to use vivid descriptors. You want to make sure that you tackle all different senses, what it sounds like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, what it looks like. So you can evoke those images inside of the minds of your audience. But we do see some interesting research with regards to how abstraction works in a number of different ways. So first of all, verbal messages, of course, can use very general terms, and they'll conjure up very different images in the minds of your audience. So if you're using abstract terms, you may want to save them for your introduction or your conclusion when you're trying to link your topic area up to a larger, more abstract concept. But the main points want to be a lot more concrete. And as you get more specific, you more effectively guide those images. So when you are using sense imagery and you're describing a particular pathos appeal or a particular scenario inside of your speech, you can effectively guide those images into the listener's minds. Now, it's funny, I did a little research myself back in the day, and we did some studies on the differing levels of abstraction. And it's funny that we can actually see correlations between abstract terms and how we describe other individuals inside of the real world. Simon and Fielder in 1988 actually came up with what was known as a linguistic category model, that when we look at abstraction, the most concrete term is what they call a descriptive active verb. It describes something that's in the here and now. Qasim is teaching to a camera. Very, very descriptive, very specific. We can move up to an interpretive active verb, which has a little bit more of abstraction, then to a state verb, which describes a longer state of who a person is, or then finally an adjective, which is a permanent attribution of who the individual is. So, for example, let's say I had you folks back in here in the classroom, and one of you weren't listening, and I just punched you, right? So I could use a descriptive active verb saying that I punched someone, or Qasim punched somebody. We can move it up to a higher level. Some people might say I attacked the person that's out there. A little bit more interpretive as to what my character is. You could say that I detest somebody else inside of the classroom. That's a state verb, that I am not only punching you, but I detest you in some sort of significant way. Or finally, you could just use an adjective. Qasim is an abusive guy, right? And it determines, how much of a temporal fixture that we have upon a particular individual, depending on what level of abstraction we use. On the other hand, right, I could do something like I am just chatting with you or I'm talking with you in class as a descriptive active verb. I could be helping you as an interpretive active verb. I could like you as a state verb, or I could just be extroverted as an adjective to describe my particular behaviors. And what's interesting that we find is that if you have somebody in your outgroup, so somebody you don't identify with, somebody who's a stranger to you or someone who you are racist against, you will describe negative terms at higher levels of abstraction. So you would describe me as abusive if you would see me as someone outside. And then you're more likely to use those positive attributions as being long-term adjectival forms if it's somebody who's part of your in-group. So if you really like me, you might say, he's extroverted just like I am. Just like we talked about earlier, the opposite is true. So if somebody does something positive from your out-group, you're going to use a descriptive active verb. And if somebody is negative from your in-group, you're going to use a descriptive active verb. So we've seen some very interesting research. We can actually predict patterns of racism by how abstract you are with negative associations and then how concrete you are with positive associations, describing other individuals from other different areas in the world. Very interesting research done by Fielder and Samin. We also know that messages can deceive, right? So a lot of times we use messages, and of course we as human beings, are unfortunately in situations where we lie towards other individuals. And interestingly enough, there was a lot of research back in the 1970s and 1980s that described the best way that you could figure out if someone is lying to you is through their nonverbal communication. And we have tells or poker faces or things like that. But in truth, now, when it really comes down to trying to catch someone, the best way to figure it out is through their verbal communication. So we find that behaviors that accompany lying are things like holding back certain messages, less cognitive sense or fidelity within the actual conversation that they're having, more of a negative impression of a particular situation, and that people are more tense while communicating. So let's say we were to go back to, maybe your high school days, and you had a curfew, right? So you had to be at home by 10 o'clock at night, and you find yourself in a situation where you're coming home late. Who knows? You're out having a good time, watching a movie or something like that. And then so you come back home and your parents catch you. Oh, no, right? So they're going to ask you, well, what did you do? Well, first you're going to hold back. Oh, I was out. Well, what were you out doing, right? You're going to continue to hold back because you don't want to give too much of that information away. But eventually you might say something, okay, fine, yeah, sorry, me and the boys went out and we caught a movie or something like that. So then, instantaneously people are going to ask you questions about the movie. Well, what did you really think about the movie? What was the storyline? These types of things. And then so you might start to put yourself under a higher cognitive load because now you've got to construct what's actually happening and the timeline of events that you went through in that particular situation. You're also going to give negative impersonations of it because, you don't want to continue that conversation. So how was the movie? It sucked. It wasn't that good. Because if you say you enjoyed it, they're going to try and ask you more about it. And of course, the entire time we might find ourselves in a situation where we're tense about a particular situation. Now, the truth is, though, is that when it comes to proper human communication, interpersonal communication, you can't go around your entire life saying, oh, everybody around me is going to deceive me. Everybody around me is going to lie to me. If you are in that situation, you're not going to formulate the interpersonal relationships that are going to make your life meaningful and fulfilling throughout the course of your life. So most of us go through our lives with what we call a veracity bias, that we assume that other people are telling us the truth. I maybe met some pretty bad pathological liars in my life, but they weren't completely pathological. It wasn't like every single thing they said was a lie. They just were real big embellishers, So we should, and we do, for a majority of the time, we're not trying to catch somebody in a lie. So we go around with the assumption that people are telling the truth in a majority of different situations. And when we start to lose this and we start to distrust other individuals, we often find that this leads to severe consequences in the interpersonal relationships that we engage in. We also notice that messages vary in politeness. So if you notice from today's lecture, we have messages varying in levels of abstraction, connotation versus denotation, levels of politeness. So a lot of this has to deal with axes. When we're thinking about communication, it's not necessarily just one or the other, but oftentimes we can be more polite in our conversations or less polite in our conversations. So I'm sure all of you folks can probably think of a straight shooter, one of your friends who just tells it like it is, right? But on the other hand, maybe you are a little frustrated because they don't really care about your emotions or feelings when they're disclosing information to you as well. So we do see that as far as communication strategies go, people use direct versus indirect messages. So sometimes if I can use an indirect message and you get the hint, then I get to save your face a little bit. The other person doesn't feel so offended, but they still understand what the message actually is. But the problem with an indirect message is that sometimes it flies over like a lead balloon. Sometimes they don't get the actual message that's being presented to them, so you need to be more direct. And of course, this varies in levels of politeness. So direct messages are usually less polite. You're not trying to save the other person's face. You're just telling them like it is. And then indirect messages allow you to express a desire without insulting or offending the other party. And a lot of times we try to do this to save face because if a person gets offended, then oftentimes that can lead to a more of a communication breakdown than a situation where you're getting your message across in a more direct way. Oftentimes these are decisions that we have to make inside of an actual conversation. Another one that we're going to take a look at, and if there's a word like onomous on a PowerPoint slide, you better bet it's going to be on a midterm exam. So messages can be onomous or anonymous. And this, of course, has a lot to deal with our own everyday lives about how much attribution we give to real sources that are out there or how much actual authority we give to the research that we find. Back in the day, it used to be, all research we'd find in a book, the book had an author, the author had a cover sleeve, we knew exactly who the person was. In today's day and age, everything seems to be on a YouTube page or on a web page, and so much more of these anonymous messages oftentimes can carry with them low levels of credibility, flaming, attacks on other individuals. And to separate these things out really helps us, especially when it comes to what we talked about in Chapter 2, the disinhibition effect, that anonymous messages oftentimes involve a lot more disinhibitions and attacks of other people, racist slurs, things that wouldn't normally be socially acceptable. So anonymous messages are messages that are signed. The author of the message is clearly identified. And remember, for all of your speeches in this class, all of our major speeches, the informative and the persuasive speech, you will need to have anonymous quotations. We need to know who is the person who is supporting your particular claim. So anonymous messages are signed. We know who the person is. We can establish their credibility. Anonymous messages are unsigned. The author is not identified. And I think this is the biggest problem, right? People say, oh, I heard an article or I thought I saw a study, and it turns out it came from a person who never signed it off. We don't know what their qualifications are, and we can't engage in the first line of basic critical thinking skills to see if the person actually knows what they're talking about when incorporating information inside of a speech or inside of a conversation, a political discussion, etc. So remember, onymous is signed, anonymous is, of course, anonymous. Now, so there's a lot of interesting research about abusive language, assertive language, and passive language. And then, of course, there's passive-aggressive language. Inside of the wide world of interpersonal communication, there have been tons of these studies where we've tried to figure out, what's the most destructive form of human communication with other people that are out there, especially inside of interpersonal relationships. I'm sure all of you folks can think of a passive-aggressive communicator that's out there. I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you folks have probably given the silent treatment to somebody in the last month. Or maybe you did a kitchen sink type of argument where you threw something that you just knew would hurt the other person as opposed to actually argue against the points that they're in. We've all been there at certain times in our lives, and we all know we probably shouldn't go back there, but oftentimes we get caught in communication circles. Now, a guy by the name of Dominic Infante, I think he was at the University of Oklahoma at the time, was doing a lot of research on this abusive communication circles, right? There are these spirals. There's tons of research trying to figure out how we can avoid, being trapped in a cycle of abuse with a future partner, that we're not replaying out, abusive parts of our past or past relationships and future relationships. Is there a better way that we can use communication to, enlighten us and to put us into a better situation for future relationships? And he talks about this notion of a difference between aggressiveness and assertiveness. So assertiveness, of course, is this ideal situation, and it's hard to get there, especially when you're all caught up having a fight with someone else. But it's a willingness to stand up for your own rights, a high level of your own personal needs, but also making sure that you have respect for other people. You're not trying to downgrade them, denigrate them, disconfirm their behaviors in any type of way. And a lot of people have said that when it comes to conflict, interpersonal fights that you're having with a relational partner, or even team-building exercises where you have a collective challenge, making sure that you focus in on what the actual issue is, as opposed to the emotions that are surrounding it, is the best way to move out of an aggressive pattern of communication and more towards an assertive one. So assertive situations, you want to make sure that you identify the problem, which is oftentimes not interpersonal. It is a physical problem that is out there in the real world, or a particular communication episode where something went wrong. Then, again, much like we talked about in Chapter 3, you want to use I language to describe how the problem affects you. You're not trying to place blame upon the other person or create a controversial head-butting situation, but rather you want to say, hey, this is how I feel about this particular situation. You want to make sure that trying to propose a solution that can actually be workable between individuals, in a way that makes us all feel good at the end. And this is oftentimes one of the hardest stages, right? To say, I think if we do this, we can be in a better place. And oftentimes thinking about that, it really calls for a level of empathy with the other individual that's out there. Also calls for, some creative thinking with regards to how you can solve the situation. Otherwise, you probably would have solved it in the first place. And then, of course, finally confirming understanding. Like, do you hear me? Are you with me on this? Do you understand where I'm coming from? You don't have to necessarily agree with me, but do you understand my position in this particular situation? And this, of course, can pull us out of that ugly, evil world of aggressive, abusive communication and more into a world of where we're just assertive with each other. So in communication, a lot of times when we try and take a look at the larger picture, some individuals use confirming language and some people use disconfirming language. So again, kind of going back to the lecture that we talked about with regards to listening, a lot of times when we're listening to another person, we can confirm their identity, we can see who they are as a person, we can reflect back and paraphrase what they're saying, or we switch topics, we ignore them, we disconfirm them in some kind of way. So disconfirmation is a communication pattern in which you ignore someone's presence as well as that person's communication. So you're changing topics, you're not listening to them, you're repeating the last sentence that they said, you've got a kind of perspective on the world. Versus confirming messages, which seems simple, but they're a little bit harder to practice in real life, which is the opposite of disconfirming. You acknowledge the presence of the other person, and you indicate your acceptance of that person, of this person's self-definition, and as your relationships defined or viewed by this particular person. So, kind of putting in that little extra level of empathy and then making sure that you are with them. Remember, that is the most unique aspect of interpersonal communication, is that bond that we create with another human individual. It's what separates us from the animals, and making sure that we indicate our acceptance of that person through our communication behaviors will lead to more fulfilling relationships inside of your interpersonal world. So, we can disconfirm by not acknowledging the other individual that's out there. But one of the biggest ways in which we disconfirm other individuals is through stereotypical behaviors, or what we'll refer to as the isms. So we talked a little bit about Fritz Heider and this notion of what we call sort of this cognitive miser perspective. If I can lump you into a group or categorize you under a stereotype, it takes less mental energy. And there's a natural biological reason why we do this, because we want to save energy. We want our brains to use less sugar. We want our brains to consume less oxygen. We want to find an easy heuristic to navigate throughout life without having to consistently think about every aspect of every individual who we encounter. So we do have these natural tendencies, especially if we have an affective disposition. So something bad happened to me from someone from race X. Now I have a mental justification to hate all individuals from race X. And we have to fight against that, right? You have that knee-jerk emotional reaction to a particular race because of your interactions with one person. But that's not how the world works, even though our brains will want to move us that way. So we find ourselves in situations where we may stereotypically look at people with regards to their race or engage in racist behaviors. We may look at issues of gender and engage in sexist behaviors that are out there. Also, in addition to that, we may have issues with the LGBTQ community, right? And we might engage in heterosexist behaviors when we see the world as just being these opposite binaries of male versus female, and not acknowledge the fact that this is not necessarily a very binary category, right? If there's one thing that everybody will end up learning from this class, right, is that the world is a bunch of shades of gray. That's for sure. And oftentimes when we look at it as being black and white, this is what leads us to these categorical assumptions. And, of course, this notion of racism, sexism, heterosexism, or one of the favorite ones that's happening to me now that I'm an old-ass man, good old ageism, this young versus old, when we find ourselves in a situation where we have some sort of some sort of ism, or we start to discount other individuals based around the age that they're at. So trying to avoid disconfirming individuals with these isms is something that logically makes sense. We don't want to be racist. We don't want to be ageist. But you remember, we do have a natural biological tendency to try to categorize. And so we have to constantly remind ourselves to break out of that biology and put ourselves in a better position. So what are some tips and techniques that we can do to get around this? Well, the first is what we call intentional orientation versus extensional orientation. So an intentional orientation is a tendency to view objects, people, and events in terms of how they're labeled, right? The intentions of or intention of that actual category. So this is that notion that we're categorizing things by the labels as opposed to how they actually exist inside of the real world. We are a panoply of different people, different identities, all different types of scenarios, and we need to try to force ourselves to think through each one of those. We have to adopt what we call an extensional orientation, a tendency to first look at the person or who they are and try to blind yourself to these stereotypical assumptions and behaviors. And then, after we've looked at that, formulate an opinion afterward, right? So look at people, objects, and events, and then afterwards go back and see if they fit the categories or the labels that we have associated with them. This, of course, takes a heck of a lot more cognitive effort, and that's why we need to consistently remind ourselves to have that different type of orientation. The second, of course, is allness. So I was just reading an article about how Jeff Bezos has this 70% rule, that he made all of his decisions at Amazon when he had about 70% of the information. And most individuals, according to him, wait till they get to 90%, but then it's too late, and you end up missing the wave or missing the curve or something along those lines. You're never going to know everything 100%. Some people, maybe even some of those procrastinators that are out there, have perfection complexes where you want to make sure you've worked out every single little detail about something before you perform, before you engage in the activity. But we don't. We don't have that all. We never grasp it all. And that we should always think of ourselves as incomplete, right? That we haven't completed anything. Because then, of course, this gives us the opportunity to grow and change as we begin to interact with other people, or even as we work on ourselves. So you might want to try to avoid this notion of allness, that you captured the entire thing inside of your brain. Your brain wants to do this because as soon as the category is filled, it can put it away, put it up on a shelf, and you're done, right? So again, this takes a lot of extra cognitive effort. So you may think you may know everything about a certain individual, right, or a certain area, but you don't know everything. You should always think about things as being incomplete. And a useful extensional device that can be added is that you should add an extra etc., right? So to avoid all this, end each statement with an etc. So this is COSM etc. I might be a different person when we're teaching back in the classroom next week, or I might be a different person after this lecture or wherever I go tonight. I never really even know myself. There's always COSM etc. And you should think about this with your friends too. Even if you were listening to that friend who's going through the fourth breakup and it's the exact same story over and over again, you always want to think, well, hey, maybe they've changed, maybe they've learned something from this. There's always an etc. at the end of it. And what it provides is a reminder that there's more to learn, there's more to know, there's more to say. Every statement, every person, every concept is inevitably incomplete, that there's always something else to add on to it. And this will keep your cognitive associations open and gives you the opportunity to take in new data, new information, and add to the rich tapestry that is interpersonal communication with your significant others. Now this is a big one, the fact inference conclusion. So I'm sure all of you in today's day and age can say that there's a problem with regards to who we are as individuals and how we are becoming polarized in this particular society, how we're seeing things in more black and white, how we're more aggressive towards each other because we've already assumed who the other person is. And, of course, the fact that we can't even agree upon actual facts that are out there. You know, some individuals don't even believe certain things are real because they haven't even tapped into the different types of evidence that demonstrates that. It's not presented in their everyday lives. It's one of the problems with YouTube and the algorithm. You keep on clicking on YouTube, it keeps on giving you what you think you want to see, and you never hear anything that goes to the contrary. And this is a big problem because language itself does not create a situation where we can differentiate facts from inferences. So one of the biggest problems is that language enables us to form statements of facts and inference without making any difference or any association between the two. So I can come up with a factual statement. I can say 16 people died today or something along those lines. But I can also come up with an inferential statement. 16 people died because of that darn politician or that darn race, right? And it still has the same sort of language that's out there. And one of the problems is, and one of the problems I see with all of my friends too, they'll send me over their favorite YouTube or their favorite podcast, and it's just some angry person, you know, someone yelling and screaming about the facts as opposed to just presenting the facts. And this is where we see the line between journalism and punditry, right? This punditry is this new sort of way that we want to hear not only the facts, but we want to hear the facts with somebody's anger, with somebody's, you know, outrage about a particular issue that's out there. And the language structures aren't any different, you know, but it creates a barrier to clear thinking. As Aristotle says, when we are heightened in a state of emotion, you know, we are not using the same logos that we would normally use in a particular rationed or reasoned discussion. So this creates a barrier to clear thinking when inferences are treated as facts, a tendency that we refer to as fact-inference confusion. And I think this is probably one of the biggest problems in today's information age, that we have facts that are out there and the inferences, you know, the opinions that we pull from them, but nobody is clearly distinguishing these from each other. And I'm sure we'll bring it up time and time again throughout the course of this class. And of course, this becomes a problem, especially with persuasive speeches. So this is a cool one. I really like this about the book. So, you know, we heard the phrase discriminatory, right? Like, you know, somebody's engaging in discrimination, and we see it as kind of a bad thing. So the book kind of turns this on its head. It says that, in fact, we should be more discriminant, because when we discriminate among different things, we get a better picture of what they are. And really, the bad thing is what we call indiscrimination. Because if you really think about it, racism, sexism, ageism, heterosexism, this all involves indiscrimination, a form of stereotyping in which you look at these similarities of all individuals inside of a particular group, rather than focusing on the differences between individuals in that group. So everybody from race X has this characteristic. That's not entirely true, Maybe in some situations you might find that a majority of people from race X have a characteristic, but it's never the complete situation. So we're being indiscriminate. We're saying, oh, this characteristic is completely carte blanche all over all these people from race X or gender Y or, age Z. Age Z. I think that's what I would call myself now. I'm an age Zer. So we have individualistic differences inside of that group. So what we should do is we should discriminate inside of the category. We should use an index, a spoken or mental subscript that identifies each member of a group as their own individual. So there's a great TED Talk by this guy named Nate Silver, and he writes an amazing book called The Signal and the Noise. He runs a website called 538. He's a huge statistician, for those of you folks that love statistics, and I know you all do. But he says that the best way to fight against racism in today's society is just simply immerse yourself in the other race. Because when you meet enough individuals from a race that's other than yourself, you're going to eventually notice the differences between those individuals. You're eventually going to create an index and say, oh, well, I think they're all blank. Oh, no, wait, hang on a second. This guy isn't like that. That girl isn't like that. Ah, man, I can't say that about the entire race. So he just says mere exposure with individuals from a race. And if you get enough people, it'll eventually break down those stereotypes. In fact, actually indexing, individuals as unique individuals within that larger stereotypical practice. Now, of course, we've got to talk about polarization, right? We're polarized. Everything is black or white. Everything is right or left. Everything is blue or red. It is just insane. And anyone who still fights for the middle on anything is just being excoriated. They are just being ripped apart by media because we can't put them into a nice little tight category. We can't put them on the red media or the blue media or these kinds of things. And polarization, we all know that the world is not black or white. The either-or fallacy, the black-white fallacy, right? We don't see things in complete and different boxes. There's no situation, except for obvious examples that are out there, like black or white, where we have complete opposites and everything falls within one particular category or another. I mean, even with black or white, we can say shades of gray, right? So we have a tendency to look at the world and describe it as in terms of extremes, because this helps our mental categories, right? We can say that this is far away from me, this is close to me. The further we push things away, the easier it is for us to mentally categorize things. In social psychology, we refer to this as the polarization and homogenization effect. So we see things that are different than us as farther away from us than they really are, and we see things that are close to us as closer and more homogeneal, more like us than they really are as well. So, it's funny. So think about some of these toxic relationships, right, where people have borderline personality disorders, where they like you for 1 second and they really like you. They completely think they're completely like you until there is a break, and then the borderline splits, and then the other person is now polarized against you. They think that they're radically different from you. They think that they're completely against you in some kind of way. So we tend to look at it extremes, right? We tend to look at good or bad, positive or negative, healthy or sick, brilliant or stupid, rich or poor, so on and so forth. This has been investigated in communication research for quite some time now, going back to the original research by Dahlia and O'Keefe on what we call cognitive complexity. And during the actual lecture in class, we'll do the actual test. But we have a tendency, of course, to see things as homogeneal when they're like us and they're things that we enjoy. And then when things are different than us and we choose to selectively expose them, we see them as far away or polarized away from us. The fact is oftentimes our similarities are way, way larger than our differences. And I'd probably say 99.9% of the time. So in these particular situations, we need to seek out the middle ground. We need to make sure that we're constantly checking ourselves, because it is a natural human tendency to polarize the world in terms of either-ors. So one of the other situations that we have in a lot of, I think we just briefly mentioned what's known as the confirmation bias in Chapter 2. But one of the other tendencies that we engage in human beings is what's known as static evaluation. So we see a temporary situation and we give it permanent characteristics. And when people are taking introductory to psychology classes, oftentimes this is referred to as the state-trait dichotomy. So you may have a state, like right now I might be feeling pretty good because I'm kicking butt in this lecture, right? But that's not a trait. I'm not going to be the best professor or feel this good at all given points in times. The same thing is true of things like depression. If you ever hear these depression commercials that are trying to get you to take whatever new medication is out there, they always say, if you've had depressive symptoms for over 2 weeks, because a person can feel blue or sad for one day, or maybe even a couple of days. But it is not a trait. It is not a static evaluation until it's gone on for a longer point in time. So we want to make sure we avoid this in our own lives, too. So oftentimes we retain a judgment of a person, despite the inevitable changes in that person, in a static evaluation. So the confirmation bias says that when it comes to your own actions, you'll favor your own intentionality. When it comes to other people's actions, we'll see those as permanent. So let's say you're in a relationship and it's it's Valentine's Day, right? And you forget to buy flowers for your partner. So you forget to buy flowers. They're going to see you as being a person who doesn't love them, that you've never loved them, that you're a horrible person. You're going to give me a static, long-lasting trait that I am a bad person on the inside. I'm going to use these adjectives like abusive, right? Because I didn't buy you flowers. However, me, right, if I forget to buy you flowers, I'm going to give it a short, light interpretation. Oh, I just forgot. I wanted to get you flowers. I was thinking about it the entire day. I just didn't have the time. I will excuse that behavior, right? I will try and disconfirm that as being part of my longer self-image. But we should just always fight against this in all situations, right? Somebody might have just forgot. Flowers are just flowers, right? These types of things, as opposed to trying to give it a trait circumstance saying this person is evil forever. So when we guard against static evaluations, we should always think about the date. That I had known this person at this time. I've had this interaction in this temporal context. They may be feeling blue at that point in time. They may be down. They may be tired. They may be, forgetful in these particular situations. But that is just them now, right? That you want to make sure that you have a mental subscript that enables you to only look at it in the context of that particular time. If you see a series or patterns of behaviors, then you might want to start thinking about more of a static or trait-oriented way of looking at a particular individual. But we want to make sure we give people the benefit of the doubt because we change with time. And time is one of those concepts that it's hard for us to understand inside of interpersonal communication. To see someone as ever-changing involves lots of more cognitive effort. To quote my favorite philosopher from the pre-Socratic days, Heraclitus once said, "You can never step in the same river twice, because the river is always changing." And I think we should always be thinking about other individuals as always changing. I'm sure one of these days I'll look back at this YouTube lecture and go, gosh, man, did that really represent a point in my past, as I probably will become, maybe a better professor as time goes on.